Welcome to the American Wine Journey podcast series. This is podcast episode number 1, and it's part of the overall Journey More Often podcasts that we're doing. Today, it is Gary Moore with Journey More Often. That's me, and we have here with us
Ben Cody with 1723 Vineyards.
So what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about wine, and as you can see, we're located in the vineyard. Thanks, Ben, by the way, for hosting this.
I'm glad you're here. Thanks for coming out.
Appreciate that very much. So let's just get started on talking about what's going on with wine. How did wine even get to America?
Well, that's an interesting question. Depends on what story you want to believe. If you go all the way back to the Vikings, some of their writings would, depending on your interpretation, would indicate they found grapes here. Now, I can tell you that whatever grapes they would have found were probably not suitable for making wine. I think part of that was to get other folks potentially to come settle with them. Obviously
Right.
they had a history of kind of suckering people in, moving west with them. But the first real, what I would consider the first real attempt at commercial grape growing here was an endeavor that William Penn embarked on in 1641 and 2.
Wow, that's pretty early in the scenario, right?
It's very early. The English loved wine, and they were very dependent on trade with the French, and to get wine, and they didn't like that because obviously they were at war for the longest of times.
Oh, yeah, because you can't grow wine very well in.
Yeah, in England, now they're doing champagne sparkling wine. There's pretty good, but back then, no, you couldn't.
It's just, it probably was incredibly difficult to grow wine there. So,
Yeah.
like you said, they're dependent on France, Spain, Italy, and
Yeah.
and those relations weren't always.
No, they weren't.
Amicable.
The most later on they developed a relationship with the Portuguese and port wine, which of course is an English favorite. I like it too, and that's been the most enduring trade partnership in the history of written history, at least anyway.
Yeah.
But back then they didn't have that in the 1600s,
Wow.
and so they were looking to colonize. And one of the things
Yeah.
they wanted was they wanted silk and some other stuff too, but they wanted wine. They wanted wine.
So William Penn took this endeavor on.
He did, yeah.
Was this sponsored by the king?
Obviously his land grant was given directly by the king, but he had hired a French vigneron. It's a French word for wine grower. A guy named Andrew Doze who wanted to come, and he was a Huguenot. So of course he was motivated to get out of France because Huguenots were not particularly popular at that point.
At that time.
At that time, and so he recruited a wine grower and bought a bunch of vines and came on over to do a planting.
Wow, saw an opportunity, and then that just got it started.
Yeah.
So what did they do? I mean, did they just how do they find a place to grow
wine? Of course, William Penn had this huge land grant. He started it all right there in Philly. I will say that the site that they picked out is a fantastic site. I mean, I when I went and saw it, I was like, I wish I owned this and I would plant this right now. I mean, that part they nailed. It's a fantastic site.
So, all right, what is the site?
I was waiting for you to ask.
Yeah. So, you teed me up on that one.
So it's in Fairmount Park, downtown Philly. It's an area called Lemon Hill, in particular, and it's right there on the Schuylkill River. It is got south-facing slopes. It's rocky up there. Back then everybody thought that to be a world-class vineyard site you had to be on the river. It's not true, but they kind of subscribed to that philosophy back then. It was right there, and it just big sheer cliff, and I mean it is an awesome site. When I went there to check it out, I'm like, dude, I would love to plant this. This would be so cool.
So they don't have vineyards there now?
No, they did not.
So they just got rid of them, or
it failed
over time.
So they got here, and then they realized that we have things like powdery mildew and downy mildew here that they did not have in Europe at the time, and so they had come up with techniques to counter that. And the vines did not have American native vines have natural immunity to those, but the European vines did not.
That would make sense.
They'll grow, but you're not going to get much of a harvest off of them, and it'll eventually catch up with them because they just can't really fully establish.
Right, right. Well, yeah. So they actually encountered something much different than they were used to.
I'm sure they were bummed out. Probably couldn't quite figure it out.
So then from there, okay, so if that failed.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we have wine that's grown in the country. So where do we go from there then?
Well, so they failed. They gave it the good old college try, and then they, William Penn died. They went on their separate ways, and they kind of, I guess, moved on to other endeavors. And it was interesting. William Penn's son Thomas Penn continued to inhabit that land. They had a pretty big house, I think, nearby. And he was big into quote unquote gardening. And when I mean gardening, I don't mean like growing potatoes and corn, and more like longwood gardens, that decorative kind of style of garden. And he had right near Fairmount Park, he had a big garden that was open to the public and all these things. So he was constantly looking for, things to put in that garden to show, flora and fauna and all those sorts of things. And, his gardener, again, this is more, you think of it more of a curator, was back at the old vineyard site and found a vine growing down by the banks of the river.
Still growing, one that had survived the...
Well, no, come to find out, it was one that had crossed. So it was a Bordeaux vine that had crossed with a native vine. So it was the first true hybrid.
Okay.
The gardener's name was James Alexander. They called this thing the Alexander grape.
Of course.
That kind of provided the foundation for the grape industry, the wine industry here in North America for a couple hundred years to come, which we'll talk about in a bit, perhaps on the next podcast. But it's a whole journey that started with this Alexander grapes. It was the first hybrid. It did pretty well, and it had pretty decent fruit. People could make wine with it. You could get it ripe, and it survived.
So they took that one that was a cross. It was a hybrid.
Yeah.
They took that and then they grafted it into an entire vineyard because it was obviously a hardy.
Yeah, exactly.
Hardy vine.
That's the thing people don't realize. Vines, you can just take a cutting and put it in the ground, and it'll start to grow roots and everything.
Really?
I've seen in wet years where the vines, they get confused and will start growing roots up in the air because it's a really wet year here. You'll see rooting even on the new growth on the vine way up in the air.
That is pretty crazy. So I could take some vines from here and go to my house and do it? Because I have a south-facing hill.
You could, but like you said, that Alexander grape was phylloxera resistant, which is one of our soil pests. For the grapes we're growing here, none of them are. So you would need to graft it. You would need to find a wild vine, plant that first, and then graft on. Like even here, we have vines that are 100% European, and we have some that are crosses or hybrids. But even those hybrids, they're so vinifera-like, which is the European subspecies, that they're not phylloxera resistant. So you need it needs to be a true American vine in the ground.
So you have to all right. So you have to play by the rules, so to speak, nature's rules.
That's right. That's right. But that's the same way in Europe now too. Phylloxera made its way over there, and everything there is planted on an American vine.
So from there, we because man does not live on Bordeaux alone, right? So
that's right.
So we had, you obviously your testimony to that because you're drinking some of
some Albarino from Galicia.
Oh, that's good stuff.
Well, from here, but the vine came from Galicia.
And I had that's right. So and I have the proprietary blend, which is
it was just Bordeaux.
Yeah.
It is all the
so this man drinks Bordeaux, but on the other hand, what happened after the Alexander grape then?
Well, so they put it in this garden, made a big deal out of it. People became very interested in it. It became started to be propagated, kind of took off. And people all the way to west to Ohio and north to certainly to Massachusetts, maybe even a bit further north than that, started planting this grape and making wine with it. So it was kind of the first grape that people were able to successfully establish vineyards with. Now, the other interesting thing that was going on at the same Alexander was big for quite some time, but then what you also saw was the emergence of Catawba, which was another chance crossing in somebody's backyard between a native vine and That may have been Pinot Noir. I've got an interesting story about the Alexander grape. I think one of the parents of that is Pinot, but
Right.
again, one of those grapes that didn't make it, but the crossing did, and so Catawba came on, and that became an even bigger deal than the Alexander grape.
So it's empirical derivation.
Yeah,
What we have is something that actually happened in the wild, and you're going, okay, so this thing survived.
Exactly.
Let's see what it can do.
yeah. There's some people that say the Alexander grape is still alive and well in Brazil. It's called Isabella down there.
Of course,
Nobody knows because nobody kept a copy of what's here, but there's it's a synonym down in Brazil. I mean, you can get it here. Like the one of the nurseries that I get vines from, still propagates Isabella, but you don't really know if that was the true Alexander grape or not.
Right.
But it's a synonym for it, or excuse me, not a synonym, but what do you call the also known as alias?
Yeah.
Thank you. It's an alias for it.
AKA, yeah.
It's an alias for it down in Brazil.
Yeah,
who
so
knows?
yeah, and you without doing a full DNA
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
breakdown, you wouldn't
Yeah.
know if it was.
But
exactly
what's
the same.
interesting about the parent of Alexander was that I looked it up and I just assumed, well, it'd be Merlot or Cab Franc or something like that. But they weren't really growing much of that in Bordeaux at the time. It was mostly Malbec and Petit Verdot, believe it or not.
Wow.
So, when you think about what William Penn and Andrew Doze brought over, those would have been the two dominant grapes. They may have brought something else, but those probably were the bulk of their plantings.
So the first grapes that survived were actually literal survivors.
Yeah,
They only survived because they
Crossed. Yeah.
and it became a hybrid with local
Yeah, exactly.
species. That's really crazy.
Mother Nature finds a way, man.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
the crazy thing.
Then that's
Life
the hardiest.
finds a way.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It-
and he'd lived there for a generation. Keep in mind, this is Thomas Penn. William Penn was dead. So, I mean, this is at least, 25, 30 years after they planted it. So that thing had been living a long time.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me that when Diane and I were in Spain one time, we were at this one winery. And
Yeah.
we were standing on top of they had an observation deck that looked over a good 1,000 acres
Yeah.
of vineyard.
Wow.
And the guy goes, look over there. I want you to look over there in the corner of that field over there.
Yeah.
And he goes, we found a vine that survived the blight
Yeah.
in
Blocks
Europe,
well.
and you're like, wait, what? And it's the survival. So they took that and they grafted it into a couple of rows of in their vineyard, and it was it was producing some really good wine. So
Oh, I bet, that's
it's
what you-
amazing. So
Well, man, I grew up on a cattle ranch, as most people know, doing some fruit farming too. But in the cattle business, when you obviously at some point you need to kind of refresh your herd, your cows
Right.
get old. You pick the you buy new bulls because you need DNA diversity. You can't have
Right.
interbreeding. But for the female cows, you pick the cows that produce the longest, and you get the calf crop off them
Right.
to use as your replacement cows
Oh, that makes
because they have produced the longest, they've lived the longest, they've been fertile the longest, and
so nature's the same regardless of plant.
yeah,
or-
we obviously it's intentional, when you're growing cattle, but nature works the same way.
Right.
Survival of the fittest. It's that's the way it works.
So where are we going from? We now we're expanding. We're
Yeah.
beyond the Alexander grape.
Yeah.
Where you said Catawba, right?
Yeah, Alexander was a big deal.
Then
for-
they found that Catawba cross.
Yeah, I think Alexander probably had close to a 100-year run. And then Catawba was the next big thing. That was found in a garden down in Maryland, like right around D.C., like in the D.C. metro
Okay.
area. At least that's what everybody thinks. And then that got started propagated, and that was hugely successful. There was they produced a lot of that in Ohio in particular, which at the time was probably the biggest wine growing region in the U.S. And there was a couple wineries there that produced sparkling with it because it's late ripening and it's really acidic.
Ah, okay.
And they produced a sparkling with it, and it even won some competitions in France. There were a couple of wineries there that won some competitions in France with Catawba.
Well, at that time, that's doing something.
Yeah, it was. This guy's name is Longsworth, I think. I have to double check that, but it's Longswood or Longsworth. And yeah, he won some competitions. And, you've got some old school folks back in Ohio now that are going back to Catawba and doing sparklings with it, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah. So which is funny that it actually won a competition in France.
Yeah.
'Cause France dominated that.
It did,
Yeah.
but it's
And they're still well known for
Yeah.
good wine. But
yeah, and so Catawba had a run, And then Concord took over from there, and that's where Pennsylvania's
Okay.
dominance
Yeah.
really became strong because, now we're in in an era leading up to Prohibition, and so the Welsh family, among others, were big planters of that, and they were pushing grape juice, and they were pushing. Well, of course, they were making grape jelly and things like that, but they were pushing that agenda pretty hard, and so Pennsylvania. Well, today we're fifth in the nation in grape production. I think we were even larger back then, but it was all driven off of Concord plantings.
Grapes, period, or
Grapes, yeah.
or
We're
not wine.
We're not fifth in wine, but we're fifth
Right.
in grapes in the nation.
all wait a minute, all encompassing.
Yeah, if you consider if you throw in all the and you can make wine with Concord. Most people don't.
Welch's grape juice is
Yeah.
like everywhere.
Yeah, and you still got a lot of table grape production. It's not all Concord these days. There's a ton of other stuff they do
Right.
for table grapes. But yeah, we're fifth in the nation, man, in terms of grape production. People always look at me, Pennsylvania. I said, we're fifth in the nation in terms. Yes, I realize not all that's wine grapes, but
Yeah.
this is a
Still a
place to
big
be.
deal.
It's a huge deal.
Yeah, it's still a big deal. Who's number one? Could we guess?
California,
Yeah.
of course. Number 2 is Washington State. 3 is Oregon. 4
Yep.
is New York, and 5 is Pennsylvania.
All of that actually makes sense.
Yeah.
From a lot of the places I've been,
Yeah.
it definitely makes sense
Yeah.
because you see a lot of you see a lot of great production out on the West Coast in particular.
Yeah.
So 1, 2, and 3, no surprises.
Yeah.
We went to Willamette Valley.
Oh, yeah, it's
in
great. It's a lot of fun out
October, and I mean, you could throw a rock to the next vineyard kind of thing. There's so many places to go. You're just
I got a buddy of mine that I met through a friend at work, and he was a vineyard real estate guy. So what he did was specialize in vineyard properties, and over the last 20 years, he's may definitely retire.
Yeah. So would you see Pennsylvania actually, I mean, in the last probably 20, 30 years, we've seen a huge
Yeah.
growth in wineries in Pennsylvania. And I mean, to the point where, I mean, at one point, like 40 years ago, people were like, Pennsylvania's really not the great place to grow wine grapes.
Yeah.
And now you're looking at it and you're like, well, kind of is. And people have been successful. I mean, you go out and look at the vineyard here and you can see some good success.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's back it up. That we got to, I think, close to the Prohibition.
Yeah.
As far as how wine was. So what? To be honest with you, everybody, Ben and I could go forever on a conversation. So we sometimes have to come back to where we were, and so we've got the reign of the Alexander, then the Catawba, and you said the other. What was the other one again?
Concord.
Concord, yeah. Oh, the Concord, yeah.
Yeah,
The Concord
yeah.
took over. So what happened?
Niagara was in there too.
Of course, Niagara.
Yeah, but Niagara and Catawba were kind of both at the same time.
Hence the New York flair.
Yeah, exactly.
Where did we go from there?
Well, that went on, and especially with Alexander and some of those later grapes. I mean, there's actually a huge boom in wineries here in Pennsylvania, and now we're talking the 1830s, 1840s. There was a census done by the state, and I know in that era there was 30 wineries right here in Chester County, and there was like 50 down in York County.
Wait, what?
And
There's not 30 wineries now.
it's close to it, like 18 or 19. But yes, exactly, you're right. So, and then you had over in Lancaster County, there was almost that many, kind of in that range. So you have there was a ton of wineries down here, and
Right.
a lot of it was. A lot of it was German immigrants, because they're coming from this part. In that era, you saw a lot of German immigration,
Yeah.
and of course, winemaking's a thing there, and
Yeah.
they wanted to make wine when they got here, and beer too, but they wanted to make wine.
Oh yeah.
So they had a good run.
So there were 30 in the
30 right here.
roughly 1840 census.
One of them was at least 30 acres here of grapes.
That's
right
a good. I mean, because people don't realize back in the day what it took
Yeah, I don't.
with a farm.
Yeah, I
You
don't.
know,
I don't think there's a winery here. There's a couple that are close. I don't think there's a
Right.
winery here today that has 30 acres. of
30-acre
Yeah.
vineyard is a lot of work for,
It is.
especially for an individual farmer.
Well, and
People
back
don't realize that.
then, we plant them a little wider today so we can use mechanization.
Oh,
Back
right,
then, the
right.
European style was maybe you ran an ox through there, with a single with
3 feet or so. Yeah.
Yeah, 3 or 4 feet most. It was, and they're a little bit short vines, and all those things. So yeah, no, it would have been a dense planting, So 30 acres
God.
then would be like growing
Yeah.
60 or 70 acres now, in terms of just the number of vines and the yields. So it would have been
It's a lot of work.
a lot of work.
That's
but
a lot of grapes.
a lot of grapes, but yeah. And so you think about it, the population was a lot smaller, but I guess they were moving it,
Well, yeah, obviously until the prohibition they were moving.
Yeah.
But and they even had. I don't know that there was a prohibition against. Could you have it on your personal
so this
consumption on your
yes,
own?
so that's a great question. You had an exemption, which still exists today, that you can, as a head of household, there's 200 gallons per household. So each household can produce 200 gallons of wine. That was an exemption to prohibition, and that was actually a huge boom for the Pennsylvania grape industry, because you had Concord, which was thick-skinned, big yields,
Right.
and you could transport that to New York. And of course, everybody in New York started making bootleg wine, or
Yeah.
even, maybe not even bootleg, but whether it's truly making it at home or making it to sell in the black market. And economically, the stats are just mind-blowing. I know in Philly alone, there was estimated to be a $3 billion market during Prohibition for bootleg booze, and that was bigger than the budget for the U.S. Department of Defense.
$3 billion
in Philly.
in those dollars back then, not
Exactly.
translated.
Yeah, exactly right.
It wasn't like $500
No, it's huge.
translated to
That's
three,
what the stats say. It's a
Yeah,
huge
well,
market. I just know
yeah.
maybe more on that. I'm pretty sure that number's right. But what I do remember
Yeah.
was that was bigger than the U.S. Department of Defense budget at that time.
So one thing I know is that small businesses, whether legal or illegal, and we try to be legal.
Yeah, we're compliant here.
Yeah, we follow all the rules. But any small business does what it can to survive.
That's right.
And we were doing a wine tasting at Renault Winery, and they were doing a tour, and they kind of like let us into the tour. They were so sweet. They let us into the tour, and this guy's like, "Yeah, we've been in continuous operation for over 100 years."
Yeah.
And he saw the look on my face, and he goes, "So what's the question?" He looked at me. He's like, "What's the question?" So I asked him point blank. I'm like, "Obviously, continuous operation through the prohibition."
Yeah.
And the guy goes, "Well," he goes, "That's a great point." He goes, "Because this is how we survived."
Yeah.
And you're talking about the ingenuity of the small business owner. They are amazing.
Yeah.
You got this guy, he says, "So here's how we survived." He goes, "First of all, we sold a lot of sacramental wine to the Catholic Church." He goes, "And then we created this product. It was an elixir. We called it an elixir." He goes, "And it had a clear label on it. Do not refrigerate, will turn to wine." So essentially, people were buying the elixir, but they're just throwing it right to the fridge, because that's their bottle of wine. And like the ingenuity there is amazing if you think about it. And,
Oh, that's great.
When we saw them, it was like 90 years after or 80 years after the Prohibition.
They've got a cool story out there too, because they were back before we had all these trade agreements between all the different country trading partners that we trade with. People would throw around the term champagne as a generic term for any sparkling wine.
Right.
And when the French really wanted to, they're big on branding. It's one of the best things that they've done the best is branding, Bordeaux or Burgundy, or you drink a Bordeaux, you drink a Burgundy, you drink a champagne. And so when we finally settled that with them, there was 3 or 4 wineries in America that got to use the term American champagne, and Renault is one of those. The only one there are apparently 3 or 4. They're the one that I can.
Well, that's another. That may be another whole podcast about designations and what you're allowed to call yourself, or you're allowed to call the wine itself.
Yeah.
Because I think a number of people know that port is specific to Portugal.
Yeah.
I mean, they've worldwide trademarked it.
Right.
Like you can't call it port unless it came
That's
from
right.
there. Kind of like Scotch. It has to come from
Bourbon.
Bourbon's
another
bourbon.
thing.
Yeah. So you're looking at those things, and by the way, another ingenious move.
Yeah.
You've basically trademarked the entire world.
Yeah.
So they have to ask you for permission no matter what you do. But we're looking at most wineries don't have that option. You have to produce your own. You have to be. You have to figure out how that works with your own winery. So we've talked about we've made our way through the Prohibition.
Yeah.
And this may be a good place to stop. It's about 24-ish minutes in.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you want to give them a teaser for the next podcast, which by the way is in July 23rd?
Yeah.
We're going to be back here at the Vineyard. We're going to do this again and have a conversation.
Well, we'll talk about how the industry expanded a lot here in Pennsylvania and some of the changes that were positive from a regulatory perspective that allowed us to go from basically no wineries after Prohibition to
Right.
300 plus today. The other thing that we'll talk about is here regionally where we saw the establishment of we'll talk about how European grapevine cultivation became successful. So it wasn't until the last 70-ish years, something like that, that we could successfully cultivate classic European varietals here on the East Coast. And we'll talk about who pioneered that, how we were able to crack the code. So it literally took 300 years, maybe 320, something like whatever,
Right.
something like that, before we could successfully cultivate them here on the East Coast.
So yeah, technology caught up with the practice basically,
yeah,
and
yeah, science,
and
yeah.
people, like in the early days you were talking about, they thought it was best against a river or near a
Yeah.
river. And that's not necessarily the case. So,
just
but
make
now
it
we've
easier to get
learned.
out of
So
there.
it's that empirical data thing where it's trial and error. You
Yeah.
have to figure
Yeah.
out what works, what doesn't work, and then technology's become so much more. As we all know, because this is technology. What we're
Yeah.
doing for this podcast, it's changed so much in the last even 10 years
Yeah.
that that it's allowed the wine journey to establish itself in a better scenario. And then when you add, like you were talking about earlier, you add the regulatory agencies being a little more friendly.
Yeah.
And people don't understand what you have to go through to get a liquor license. It's really difficult, and there's a lot of questioning by the liquor board, and there's a lot of stipulations. Which one thing that people don't understand, it's not a favorite. I wish they would change this. Well, not really change it, but
Yeah.
a lot of people think that you're not allowed to bring other alcohol to a winery because they just want to sell their wine. Well, that's actually not true.
It's not true at all. We get big trouble if we had that here.
Although you can bring other alcohol to the winery, you don't get in trouble. They do, because their liquor license specifically stipulates they're not allowed to have any other alcohol
That's
but
right.
their own. So, it's not a question of, I just want to sell my wine.
Yeah.
It's a question of, I don't want to go to jail.
That's right. I don't want to lose my license. That's
Don't
the
want to
thing.
lose the license. And so, if for some reason you happen to be going to a winery and they say we can't let you bring that in there, now you know why. Because it's on them. It's their responsibility, and the government makes it their responsibility. And it is what it is. And they, you have to, and that's why that's just a future note. Anything else to leave us with?
Oh man, just glad you're here and really enjoying. Obviously you're doing a series, pretty much every week, right?
No. Actually, we're guaranteeing once a month.
Once a month. Well, I'm enjoying it, and of course, Journey More Often is all about travel. If there's something that I love almost as much as wine is travel, so I'm enjoying. And I'm really looking forward. I mean, obviously, we're going to be back together here, back in the summer. But I'm looking forward to all those podcasts between now and then that you're going to be doing about travel. And in the meantime, I'll be here. Well, not here. I'll be out there in the vineyard.
Right.
It's growing season's about to start.
I see you a lot out there. It's just pretty fun on tractor. Then you come in. It's cool to see. Everything in action, because you handle all out there, and Sarah handles
all
in
in
here.
here. Yeah.
And
If I'm in here, it's just either I might be making wine, but I'm probably drinking it. So.
Yeah. So, and Sarah's not here with us because Sarah's doing all the work in here right now,
doing
and
it all.
because it's our busy time, or your busy time, I should say.
Oh.
So one of the things that we're going to do is next month we'll probably do a live feed. No, we don't. We're not always going to do live. So we're going to record things. We'll in a couple of weeks, we'll probably record some stuff when we're out in Hawaii.
I cannot wait to hear about that.
So we'll do that, but in May we're going to be in Switzerland.
Oh, sweet.
And we're going to record in Bern, Switzerland, probably live video, hopefully, to highlight some of our ancestry, because as awkward as it sounds, Diane and I, my wife and I, are actually related. So her 14th great-great-grandfather is my 15th great-great-grandfather. And he was mayor of Bern at one point.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and there's a street named after him. So we're going to go visit that street, and we're going to do a live podcast from the street.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah.
I can't wait to hear
so
that. I love
that'll be
Switzerland,
fun.
too. I've only traveled there for business, but I can't wait to get to see the view, to see the side of it that is, relaxing.
Exactly. So, and one of the things that we'll be doing in Hawaii is I'm going there on business. So
Yeah.
we're staying the extended weekend. So, since work is paying for me
Yeah.
to go out, come back, stay at the hotel, we're extending it a couple more days on us. We have to pay for that.
Yeah, sure.
But it significantly reduces the cost for that.
that's
And
nice.
essentially, we're going to get, for a vacation for half the cost.
Ah, sweet.
So we'll be able to be in Hawaii for a few extra days, and we'll share with you how that works, by the way. That's one of the things that we want to talk about, is to share, okay, how do you parlay that? So I'm fortunate enough, I think you do a little traveling too, and I'm sure that you probably take advantage of that once in a while.
Yeah.
But, if you have to travel for work, that's one of the things that you want to consider, is that, okay, so, and by the way, even if it's like, I have a conference that it's like the go-to conference that we all have to go to in Ocean City, Maryland in the summer. So why not drag the family while you're going there? And even if you're at the conference and the wife and kids are like, or the husband and kids are enjoying the beach, why not do it,
I think that makes a ton of sense because, I travel a lot for my quote-unquote day jobs in cybersecurity, as some folks know. And, I travel a lot around the world, and it's really, travel can be stressful. Work travel can be stressful for the spouse or partner that is not traveling.
While they're right, yeah.
They may have, and so, but it's nice to be able to take them along. I think it builds.
Yeah.
It's a good relationship builder.
So we're going to leave it with this one last little anecdote. My wife did not go with me when I went to Iraq back during the war. So, and we'll talk about that later.
Well, it could be one. If you're looking to get out of your marriage, you could have done that.
Well, yeah. So there's some funny stories with that whole thing. All right, we're gonna wrap this up. Hey, everybody, thanks for joining us. This has been the first podcast episode for the American Wine Journey series. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks so much for coming.
So we are 1720 vineyards.com. We're journeymoreoften.today. You can find us on the website. You can find us on Facebook. It's not going to be hard. Join us for our next one on July 23rd. Then we have another one in September and November. Some probably in September. We'll talk to you about what we're going to do the following year. But until then, have a great day. Thank you very much.